Tourette's podcast is not a medical advice show. It's a show about experiences. In the course of that, we may talk about medications or therapies or stories from the doctor's office, but don't mistake any of that for medical advice or direction. It's not. Get that only from people or places licensed or certified to give it, not from a massively fun and action-packed podcast about our life experiences, such as
what something like Tourette syndrome can do is challenge the basic assumptions we have about how language works. And I think as we start to accommodate people with Tourette syndrome into the world more effectively, I think that audiences will learn new pathways and avenues of thinking about language. I can't wait to see what the next 10 years of rhetoric and disability will bring us. To think about the ways that just because you're marginalized in one way does not mean that you're automatically progressive in all the ways. I think it's still so important.
This is Tourette's podcast, made possible with support of the Tourette Association of America and part of the Geeks Rising Network. Hey, it's Ben. Starting off this episode with a bit of a sad note, but with details that I hope we can celebrate and feel good about. The Tourette community lost a leader in the past week. Suzanne Dobson was the chief executive of Tourette's Action. That's the UK charity and advocacy group for the Tourette community. I'm going to read this from their website, tourettes-action.org.uk. It says here, "It is with great sadness that we announce our chief executive, Suzanne, has passed away after a short illness. Our thoughts and deep condolences are with her family and loved ones who were the center of her life. Suzanne took over a small and barely known charity in 2009 and led the project of building Tourette's Action into an organization of real voice and impact, and one that has been a lifeline for many people with Tourette syndrome and their families. Suzanne was a wonderful, kind, and caring friend and colleague to everyone who worked with her and for her. We at Tourette's Action and the wider charity world will miss her very much." End quote. That's the announcement from Tourette's Action about the passing of Chief Executive Suzanne Dobson. And I'll post a link to this at tourettespodcast.com with this episode. And yeah, sad news, but certainly gives cause to think about the work that people do in this community. And I just want to read real quick Suzanne's own words about the work that she did. And this is actually right off her LinkedIn. Quote, "Aside from the financial and governance role, I am passionate about using every opportunity to make the lives of people living with TS better. To work with schools to help them understand and support young people. To work with employers to encourage them to use the skills of those living with TS. I believe that if you keep striving for understanding and acceptance, eventually everyone else will join in." End quote. That's from Suzanne Dobson, and I totally agree. Shift the attitude toward accepting instead of the urgent fixing, and then maybe the difference in pressure can be a difference in outcome. Of course, provided the right support is there. And if you're new to the podcast, this is a memo that I don't censor coprolalia, the quote-unquote swearing thing that can affect some people with Tourette syndrome. I don't censor that stuff on the podcast. Doing so would kind of defeat the point. So when you hear coprolalia on this episode, I think our guest doesn't mind me saying, let's just say hypothetically, you're brand new to this as a listener. You don't have much experience with Tourette or maybe just not with coprolalia. And you hear something and the wording sounds kind of offensive to you. Just remember, one of the reasons you might be listening right now to this podcast is to hear real experiences in the right context, in a realistic way. We're all mature enough to understand that. And frankly, the most understanding people I hear from about these things happens to be young people. And it really spreads out to the overall theme of this conversation with our guest today, Sophia Maier. She and I share an interest in language and rhetoric and the power of arranged words and things like that. But while it's just kind of an interest for me, I guess, Sophia is really deeply into this in the academic setting. It's neat listening to her connect this to Tourette syndrome and other life experiences. A goal of this could be more productive and conscious communication that wires us to be more empathetic and able to process information from another party. And this episode has real life examples of that. A time or two where I don't think I was explaining myself clearly. I might have been rambling kind of in search of an easy way to make my point and getting a little bit convoluted in the process, which would be my fault. And Sophia asks, can you rephrase it or say it another way? She wanted to understand exactly what I was saying, which is awesome because that's an intentional preventive measure to avoid walking right into a misunderstanding, potentially, which people aren't good at right now. Like, it has to be confrontational to ask somebody follow-up questions about their beliefs so you can understand them better. I'm not talking about people like, goading people or trying to be provocative or you like Trump and I like Biden or vice versa or whatever, and we're just going to ask questions to ridicule each other. Like, that's not what I'm talking about. To me, it's the only way. If you're in a dialogue with someone or a group of people and the goal is, to understand where one another comes from on the issue, whether you're agreeing or disagreeing. We touch a lot of, I guess, delicate subject matter here. And I don't think it was delicate in this context, but getting deeper with it as we go. And, we hit this from a lot of angles, I think in a really productive or at least understood way. Tourette, of course, in the connection to Sophia's life, she's trans and has some concrete thoughts on how these things link together. We also talk about that conversation that's been going on about whether to rename Tourette syndrome. Do we give it a new name? With part of the reason being to hopefully cut away from the stigma that word is carried with the public at large, which is a controversial suggestion. It's interesting. So this episode is definitely not just for the Tourette audience. There's a lot here. Let's get right into it.
My name's Sophia Angela Maier. I'm a PhD student at Penn State University in State College, Pennsylvania, but I grew up in Alpharetta, Georgia.
Well, first off, State College, I haven't been there in a long time, but I there were a few times I went to see bands play there. It's a cool town. It's a really cool looking, just had a cool kind of feel to it.
Absolutely.
What did you do at State College?
So I'm in the Communication Arts and Sciences department. I study rhetoric, which is, I suppose, one way of defining rhetoric would be thinking about how power operates in language. Mm-hmm. So I might look at speeches or memoirs, biographies, any kind of text, and I'd be interested in kind of analyzing the operations of power at work in any of those particular texts. My specialty is understanding rhetoric from a disability studies perspective. And disability studies is an interdisciplinary approach, kind of like, feminism or race studies, that asks us to think critically about what disability can mean for society.
Do you have any examples of how that can kind of play out, or maybe some past examples of things where the words and the sort of value they have or how they work together, where that kind of mattered for the disability community or for any other community?
Sure. I think one thing that hits very close to home is a few years ago, in State College, a Black man with autism and possibly schizophrenia was shot and killed by a police officer. Mm-hmm. In the report afterwards, they decided that they wouldn't press charges against the police officer. And this was from the Attorney General, mm-hmm. And in the report, they used Osaze's text messages as evidence that he had violent intent. And of course, I don't think we can know what happened one way or the other, but I do think this is an important example of thinking critically about what disability means for language. For example, I think it would be awful if people used my tics as a justification for my death. Or they'd use the worst possible thing that I've ever said. I think that mm-hmm. if we start thinking critically about how disability influences language, we start to have a revolutionary perspective on the possibilities of language. Think about it this way. Mm-hmm. I mean, you have you gone to college?
Yes.
So you've had to write probably a bunch of papers, yeah?
Absolutely.
So think about all of the physical and mental processes involved in writing that paper.
Mm-hmm.
All the time sitting up and typing, thinking, eating, drinking, just all of those various processes, life experience that go into creating a personal, essay.
Yeah.
And now think of how each of those bodily processes that you engaged in or mental processes that you engaged in, imagine them being different. And you start to recognize with different bodies comes a radically different, new, inventive set of possibilities for language. Different bodies construct language differently, and so do different minds. So that's what I'm interested in exploring right now, is the radical possibilities that disability has for thinking about language differently.
So is this more than just thinking about knowing your audience and using appropriate language that might make a person feel comfortable, or what it means to do the opposite of maybe being a little bit more haphazard with your language? Or is it something that goes beyond that? Or is that kind of the goal for us to kind of understand what the words where our words come from and why we pick the words we pick for our own personal context, and then thinking about it, kind of how we apply it? Or
apply it, motherfucker. Jesus doesn't like you. Jesus takes it in the ass. So I think that's a very interesting question. So when we get to the basics of rhetoric, being the public speaking courses, we do talk a lot about what's appropriate to a particular kind of audience, and what's not appropriate. Janelle Johnson talked a little bit about how, in a recent article, about how we have these assumptions that speaking well reflects well on you as a character. Ethos, pathos, logos. We'd start about how speaking creates your ethos or your character.
Right.
But she also introduced this term, or reintroduced this term, I guess it was a term in ancient Greece, about kakoethos, or bad character. And the idea of speaking poorly and how that reflects on you as a person to an audience. And she had some important things to say about how disabled people or disabled perspectives can really shift and change the ways that our assumptions about the link between language and character.
Okay, gotcha.
And I think that's important. I would go further, though, and say it's a little bit less about good and bad ways of speaking. I think that what something like Tourette syndrome can do is challenge the basic assumptions we have about how language works. And I think that as we start to incorporate and accommodate people with Tourette syndrome into the world more effectively, I think that audiences will learn new pathways and avenues of thinking about language. It'll make them more comfortable. For example, Jess Tom.
Yeah, Tourette's hero.
You know her? Yeah, Tourette's hero. Yeah,
definitely know her.
That's right. So I like to use her. I guess it's kind of a memoir, autobiography, something like that, as an example. She makes Tourette syndrome a lot of fun. And she talks about how if she's in the right context of people with the right audience, Tourette syndrome can be magical and entertaining and a delightful experience for everyone around them. But that requires some creativity and open-mindedness,
right?
As well as a real exploration of how language can be different. So that's what I want to discover, is what are the ways that we can think about language differently in order to better accommodate people with various disabilities and disorders and hopefully make a better world.
Yeah, where do you think that could lead with, I guess, conscious understanding of language and how it can be, even manipulate? I mean, rhetoric is a huge point of interest for me anyway, and epistemology and things like that, and just kind of how we got here. Where do you think we could take this?
Yeah, I think that's a very important question. I think the simplest answer that I have is I don't really know. I mean, there's so many unexplored possibilities for thinking about disability in relation to language. I can't wait to see what the next 10 years of rhetoric and disability will bring us. But already the work that scholars have done have revolutionized how we understand language and have really created a space for disability to be thought about in a serious, powerful way, not just as something to be erased or fixed or cured,
right,
but as being a crucial element to the fabric of human life.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been thinking about almost in that exact phrasing. I've been thinking about that more, just about the, if you really zoom in and what we call, quote unquote normal people, we throw all the quote unquote normal people together and we just really, really analyze, none of them are the same. And it's just, there is such an advantage to recognizing the diversity of life, not just for the sake of it, but also to understand your context with it and how you got to where you are and how other people can get to where they are. And
how other people.
I think about, so the line of work that I'm in, it's multimedia and photography, but it's in the context of government affairs. So there's a lot of, politics and, rhetoric is obviously, like that's you take classes on that, when you want to be an influential speaker. But just thinking about that and how that as a basis, especially right now, if you think about the language of the left versus the right and what words we use and what words we confuse, and it that affects policy and that creates policy. And I guess you would have to hope that, once we have the right kind of repetition and the right kinds of themes and campaigns and we drive it home in the right way, then yeah, maybe that does positively influence policy for disability. I kind of think, and this may be a little bit different from what you're talking about, but I kind of think back in the day about how like green building and stuff like that was kind of considered maybe kind of like a hippie ideal. And it's just kind of a thing now. You get tax credits for it, and it's
that's right.
Just much more in place as a normal thing. And the language around that has changed. I mean, it's almost like it becomes more of a normal, building practice. Green building is just kind of like a thing that you might expect now for efficiency and so on. But it's just, one of those things that kind of comes from the outside and then establishes itself. And then we kind of have it gets a new reputation and a new kind of regard. And then you get that flywheel effect of, okay, it's accepted. Now we can really take it somewhere and add things to it and, create new things and new conversations and kind of rambling. But I mean,
everything you're saying is absolutely on point. I think that green buildings are a fantastic example of the ways that a change in policy, a change in culture, and a change in various people's motivations can create a real and lasting shift in the ways we understand reality.
Yeah,
I think that's an apt metaphor for the possibilities of creating a space for not only people with Tourette syndrome, but for people whose understandings and embodiment of language defies what we consider to be appropriate or civilized.
I'm thinking about some of the language that is associated with disability, and there are differences in perception, viewpoint requests, and things like that within the community. It's, I guess we are all individuals. I know some people prefer to be called autistic. Some people prefer person with autism. And I've definitely heard both. And it's interesting, I think, arriving at consensus and what means the most and what has maybe the most historical sensitivity and lays the most, I guess, the smoothest bricks for whatever might happen down the road. It's almost like thinking ahead with the words you're going to use and how they might evolve. And
something that you might have noticed about my language choices in particular is not shying away from the word disability.
That's a really good point. Because there are some people, within the community who say, like, I don't like that word. I don't use that word. They have, maybe some like spin on it, but there's another side where it can be kind of embraced.
That's right. So I use disability very deliberately because I think that we can be thinking about how to make the world better for everyone. And we might say, I'm not disabled because I'm not like that person over there. And that becomes a distancing effect.
Yeah.
But perhaps the more profound question is not whether or not I'm disabled, but to what extent is disability a bad thing to begin with? And what is it about the world that we've constructed that makes us want to shy away from being labeled disabled in the first place?
Right.
So I'm thinking about less about how to be sensitive per se, than how to revolutionize our assumptions in order to create a better space for everyone.
I love how you said that, to revolutionize our assumptions, because that's I haven't thought about it that succinctly before, but that is, I guess, kind of what I'm hoping for with, if there's any, I guess, maybe outcome for the podcast, it's that people listening kind of recalibrate, and when they hear about, obviously, the focus here is Tourette syndrome for Tourette's podcast, but
Jesus hates Touretters.
It's like more broadly, it's also about just kind of how we fit together. And if you have something different or involuntary or something you can't control about yourself, just something from birth, then, maybe this is something you can relate to, or we can find some common language to relate to each other. But I'm such a fan of this topic, and thinking about like linguists and people who study morphology and kind of where our words came from. I was such a big fan of William Safire, which, he what do you call it? When he would like look up origins of phrases, phrase dicking, that's what he called it. And like looking up where certain things came from and how it's almost like, there may be some very offensive origins to certain words, but they just kind of erode over time and we forget exactly where they came from. And occasionally something might swoop up from history that gives that word relevance again in an offensive way. And all of a sudden, then you have an argument of like, that's not an offensive word. I've been using that since I was a kid. And, it's like, the lack of consciousness about it creates these arguments in the future that don't have to be. I don't know how to get around that, but it's definitely an observation.
Yeah. Speaking of etymologies, I'm guessing you're familiar with the etymology of coprolalia.
Yes, I know the breakdown of that word, and that's rough.
Yeah, I think it's hilarious. I mean, personally, fit talking, I love it. It's so funny. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned the point earlier about, I don't have the disability that this person has over there, and how we can kind of marginalize each other with these approaches. I mean, that definitely happens with the coprolalia community, where, people with Tourette syndrome will justify themselves to say, I don't have coprolalia, so you don't have to worry about it. Or, it's just completely unfair and marginalizing to people within your own community who are supposed to be your allies. And it's like, why do we do that? And I think we do that just because we haven't calibrated that yet, or, it maybe just hasn't occurred. Because I've heard from a lot of people, I think it was maybe Melissa C. Water in season 1 who first kind of raised that point of like, why do we do this? Why are we kind of turning against each other when we say these things? And as soon as she said that, there were a bunch of people I guess over the course of the months to follow, who wrote in and said, I was doing that and I had no idea. Like I was separating myself. I was telling people at work and my friends, like, I have Tourette, but not the swearing kind. And not even realizing that what they were doing was unfair to people who have coprolalia or, other maybe conspicuous tics. And, it's like getting to that awareness of like, okay, this is the effect of it that I just totally didn't realize because I've always done it this way, or I've always thought of it this way. And it took somebody to make me aware of my own language to realize the gravity of the situation.
Gravity. Gravity's for ducks. Ducks like gravity. Thank you, ducks, for gravity. Ducks are stupid. So I think that's a fantastic point for sure. No question about it. And I think that discourse, maybe thanks to your podcast, has started to really expand and pick up on at least on internet platforms. And it seems like people are a lot more conscious now about how to show unity within the Tourette's community. And I think that's wonderful.
I do think the community is doing better about all of this overall, about communicating and, maybe kind of owning their situation and, kind of using social media to educate their friends or people who might encounter them in the future, or strangers too. But it is encouraging to see this kind of critical mass of people doing that which makes other people, more comfortable, to kind of come forward and recognize their crowd. And also, I think the better we get at it, the easier it is to pick up cues from other people. It's almost like we evolve kind of together, and the language that ends up being the most significant and the most, repeated within the community ends up, kind of lasting and having that staying power. And it just kind of like washes itself out in a way. I hope I'm making sense. It's like, it's like the more we talk about it, the better we get at talking about it.
I think that's 100% true. And I'm actually curious as to see the next steps of the Tourette syndrome community's progression. Yeah. And that's something I'm feeling very passionately about. And I've been in contact with the TAA and various people about how to shift us to this next phase. I think it's important for our community to start working to identify instead of disidentify with various other marginalized or oppressed communities.
Yeah,
for example, I see sometimes people with Tourette syndrome, say something like, "Oh yeah, it's I have tics. I'm not on drugs." And I think that's fair. I mean, you aren't on drugs. You do have tics, but I also think that maybe you're furthering the stigmatization of people who are on drugs. And maybe, we might think more critically, all of us, about why particular ways of being in public are marginalized or thought to be wrong. And I think we can do that in a bunch of other scenarios too. I think engagements with the police are a great example. Perhaps instead of focusing on, this is fine, we can do this too, but instead of necessarily just focusing on how to make sure that you don't seem like a threat to police officers, we might use this opportunity to think critically about how our culture and policies create situations in which particular movements of particular bodies become interpreted as threatening.
Right.
And how, because of these particular policies, lots of people are in danger of being killed.
Yes. And I think I've mentioned this maybe on a couple podcasts, and people who I think saw the Tourette Gala in, what year is it, 2020. I've heard this from more than one Black Touretter about getting pulled over and, getting extremely nervous because they have tics. And what if there's a situation where they're, misinterpreted about, it's so they already have the consciousness, like I'm a Black man who's just been pulled over. Yeah. White police officer coming up. There's that tension. how these things go, and adding tics and things that might be, like misinterpreted as a violent movement or something unexpected that causes something to happen. I mean, that's like just nightmarish to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think that this is a really good opportunity to think beyond the diagnosis of Tourette syndrome.
Yeah.
Like, let's pretend that Tourette syndrome has no diagnosis for a moment. But there are these collections of people whose bodies are considered, and I've got, the historical background to show this development, whose bodies are considered uncivilized and violent and in need of correction.
Yeah.
So what if we, instead of thinking about Tourette syndrome as a particular set of diagnosis, something that you can give a card to someone so that they can know that you're part of that in-group, what if we started thinking broadly about all the people who are incarcerated right now because they didn't fit a particular expectation of nonviolence and civilized behavior? Mm-hmm. So and we can think that about this literally. What about all the people with Tourette syndrome who don't have a diagnosis? But we can also think more broadly about how to think beyond the diagnosis of Tourette syndrome to make all these connections to different groups who have been, historically oppressed. I think that, race comes to mind for sure. Black people, Latina people, indigenous people are more vulnerable to the police. Something else I think is worth thinking about is deaf people. It's not part of the conversation very much, but deaf people have been subjected to extraordinary violence by the police for supposed non-compliance to orders. So thinking about these connections and the possibilities of new alliances and new policies that could make the world better for everyone. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm rambling, but it excites me so much.
No, you're not rambling. I love this. And it goes back to what you were saying earlier about someone, could be incarcerated because they didn't fit the template of what is perceived to be, proper or civilized or orderly or whatever. And all that is so contextualized, especially, talking earlier about, what is proper language, the language we use and who's determining what's proper, who's the we, and who's discluded from that, and who in their own context is completely fine talking and communicating in a completely different way to where it's not a problem. And then you have, these sort of different, I'm kind of stretching the boundaries a little bit just to make a point, but you have these two, potentially overlapping, but somewhat also disconnected communities getting together. And then you have these miscommunications and fights. And then people can say certain things where it's like, Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter. And it's like, oh, no, we don't really mean it that way. And, it's like, that's where it gets sensitive. And I think it's really good collectively to think about this kind of thing. So, sometimes if you, I think, come to consensus too much in a silo, the consensus doesn't really have the power of community in terms of relating it to the rest of the world. And this is another thing I don't really have much of an answer to, but it is something to think about, kind of how we arrive at this sort of thing and how it applies to people who don't have that contextual understanding.
Yeah. So could you clarify your point a little bit more? I'm having a hard time following.
Yeah, so I'm kind of thinking about, say, just different cultural backgrounds where there may be different approaches to communicating words that may have different connotations in different cultures, even within the same country.
Sure.
And this is where you can get these sort of misfires on what we mean when we say certain things and the sensitivities people have to hearing certain things, or how quickly we get offended if we hear something that may be the person communicating this idea. Not to excuse them for saying something insensitive, but maybe they just didn't realize it. And it takes more of maybe a subtle conversation to kind of get past that. And people have done that with me before, where I've maybe made like an analogy or used a word or something very slang-like. And it's like, no. That's like, when you said that, here's what I heard you say.
Sure.
And, it's almost like becoming more collectively conscious of the fact that maybe if we don't get what someone is saying versus, kind of instantly running into this sort of argumentative or retaliatory mode, maybe just kind of doing exactly what you just did. Could you Could you kind of say it in a maybe a slightly different way so you can convey yourself a little bit better? And it's so, people get so weird about doing that, or maybe get offended at things like that. And it's like, why? If someone is really keen to hear your point, but just needs you to say it a little bit better, or use maybe some different words, and we can come together and finally figure it out. That's what people are so bad at these days. People just scream past each other, and
sure,
that is very it's so discouraging. And
let me point out like some of these like amazing points that you just made, and just say, I emphatically agree. I think you made some wonderful points. One thing I will say to clarify is I'm definitely not going to say that people shouldn't get offended. Like, words matter for sure.
Absolutely.
No question. No question. But I do love what you said about creating a space for growth, and creating a space for people with, different backgrounds and different assumptions to offer just a bit of understanding and allowances in order to give people the opportunity to connect. And I think that's wonderful. And that compassion is I think sometimes lost in our and I'm a communist, I'm super left, et cetera. But I admit that sometimes in the leftist online discursive spaces, that there's very little forgiveness, very little opportunity to make amends for saying the not precisely correct thing.
yeah.
And I think that allowing that opportunity to a degree of reconciliation and co-constructed worldview, it can absolutely be feminist praxis. I think it's a good way of combating classism, and educational elitism, as well as obviously being an important disability practice.
The Tourette Association of America is the premier nonprofit working to raise awareness, advance research, and provide ongoing support to those with Tourette syndrome or tic disorder. With a network of over 130 chapters, support groups, and centers of excellence, the TAA engages with communities across the nation in an effort to provide tools, webinars, workshops, and support for all seeking assistance. As a primary sponsor of Tourette's podcast, the TAA supports the authentic conversations showcasing the diverse representation of the TS community. To learn more, visit Tourette.org, Tourette.org.
This brings to mind, there have been some conversations in the science community and in the Tourette community too, but about renaming the disorder to something that maybe kind of drops the stigma of Tourette, and like a tic spectrum disorder that kind of, captures more things. And then maybe we can kind of break it down under that umbrella, with what is what, but getting away from the bad memory of how Tourette syndrome has been treated by name. And then there's the flip side of it of, no, the community has claimed that word. We've reclaimed it. We're Touretters. And, there's a solidarity aspect to it. Do you have any thoughts on that? Because my thoughts have kind of changed on it a little bit. First, I was definitely like, no, let's keep Tourette syndrome because we're finally getting proud of it. And I think my answer to that is ultimately whatever helps and brings about the most progress when it comes to communicating what this is and how people might get helped or how people might be perceived. When it comes to, marching somebody into the right kind of treatment for their specific situation. And maybe you can treat the patient more versus just treating the disorder. But do you have any thoughts on that, on sort of maybe the value that we can kind of give to a word when maybe there's also some historical damage that word carries?
I got a few thoughts on that. I think the main thing that I would emphasize is that, I'm of course down for whatever the community, writ large decides. It's not going to be hugely important to me one way or the other.
Yeah.
But as far as the renaming goes, so something I worry about is that if we simply try to rebrand Tourette syndrome, that we're not really addressing the stigma. And in some ways, we might be increasing the stigma because we're implying that, there's something wrong with the picture that people have of having Tourette syndrome. It feels like it's, trying to whitewash it a little bit. There are good reasons to remove someone's name from particular disorders. So for example, I think the renaming of like Mongoloid, that's Dr. Down, who's has a name that used various ethnicities to define different disabilities, and that's probably like not great for a variety.
I remember when I was in middle school, I took a Scantron test where you had to fill in your, ethnicity. That word was on there. So it was another word that was another oid word that was not. I was like shocked to see that. I remember that specifically. This like what?
Yeah,
that word's on here.
Yeah. But and you could of course make that same argument about Asperger's. That's maybe not a great heritage. But in the case of Tourette syndrome, I mean, he studied Tourette syndrome very, very little. Mostly he studied hysteria. But as far as I can tell, he's not like a terrible dude.
Right. Yeah.
And I think that if we start thinking we can just rebrand stigma, that's not going to work. I think we need to if we can do that, that's fine, but I think the focus should be challenging our cultural assumptions. So here's my kind of shtick. I believe that being able to say that my ability to say I have Tourette syndrome to someone else and be believed demonstrates my massive privilege.
Yeah.
Because I would have Tourette syndrome as opposed to a variety of other diagnoses that people might assume that I have.
Yeah.
Meaning crazy.
Yeah.
What's the difference between Tourette syndrome and crazy? The difference is privilege.
Yeah.
If you have Tourette syndrome, you're able to segregate and specify your oddness, and then have society say, okay, that's actually going to be okay. If you're crazy, and I think that this oftentimes is the case, if you have Tourette syndrome and say schizophrenia and BPD and bipolar and DID, if you have all these other diagnoses and Tourette syndrome, your tic won't be recognized as a tic. It would be instead, it wouldn't be an exception to your everyday behaviors. It would be indicative of who you are. So I think that what's really crucial for us right now is to stop getting in the habit of proving our respectability, proving that Tourette syndrome is, not who we are, shying away from Tourette syndrome, segregating ourselves and distancing ourselves from our neurodivergence, and instead embrace the ways that we are different and show solidarity for those who also are different.
So
I know that sounds strange, but
no. I mean, this is so you have more than one angle on this. When you became comfortable recognizing something in yourself that was just not the straight up standard model of, like the 1950s model of being born and then here's how you live. And so you're a trans woman.
Yes.
So there's the angle with, I mean, there's rhetoric with that too. And what's
sure.
How we frame the conversation to where people might have a more understandable starting point with understanding these issues, especially if you're young. And do you remember, I mean, was this all one big thing for you, Tourette syndrome, and how you were going to identify? And I ask it that way because this is kind of a crude way of asking, but there's kind of like a public eye dynamic when it comes to anything that's sort of different from the standard model. And I use that in quotes.
Yeah.
But I mean, do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh, I've got lots of thoughts on that. And I don't think it's a crude question. I think that's a fantastic and an insightful question. I'm happy to address it. So when one of the first groups that I came out to was the largest Facebook Tourette syndrome group for adults. And at least in English. I don't know about if there's any other languages with different groups. After I did that, a few people showed, lots of people showed support. Several people showed aggression. And several people complained that this was an inappropriate space for me to come out. And then I had the post was removed, and I received a warning from one of the admins saying, "Yeah, this is inappropriate. You're making some people feel uncomfortable." So then I put up a second post saying, "Okay, well, I understand y'all might be uncomfortable. Here's the various ways that Tourette syndrome and my gender identity kind of co-constitute my experience. Here's how they relate. Here's how they connect. Here's why I think it's important to bring up." The post was removed. I was banned from the Facebook group. All the trans people who protested and to the admins because of my banishments were also kicked out of the group. So I ended up having to start a new group. The reason being is I think this is just an interesting example of, the kind of, I feel like it was a wake-up call to me. To think about the ways that just because you're marginalized in one way does not mean that you are automatically progressive in all the ways.
Right,
I think it's still so important.
That is such an important point. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's so important for our communities to keep pushing ourselves to find new ways of being inclusive and intersectional as best we can.
And so the situation you were just describing, I'm completely unfamiliar with it, but I don't. If we're talking about something like Tourette syndrome and how we carry it in our lives, personally, again, without really knowing the situation, I personally struggle to see what's inappropriate about talking about other aspects of your identity and who you are and how all this kind of fits together. Because Tourette is very much a part of my artistic side and my sense of creativity and my sense of what introversion has gotten me in terms of identity and how I think about myself. And I feel very comfortable talking about all of those things. And in any sort of setting, let's just say I'm had to reveal something else about my identity that was really, kind of relevant and was something I'd been thinking a lot about. And I put it out there to maybe, create a conversation or find other people who are in the same situation so we can kind of connect for the first time. I just don't see, on its face what's inappropriate about that if you're just talking about your life and your experience. Banning, and it goes back to what we were talking about earlier about if maybe something seems a little bit off, maybe let's, maybe pause for a second so we can talk about it. So we all kind of come to an understanding. So it's like, I can understand maybe how you thought I meant this one thing, or maybe this is where you're coming from. Can I tell you where I'm coming from on this? And we can come at something like that peacefully, even if it's content or something like that we find objectionable. I've had definite, like, really nice, friendly conversations with people who are completely on the other side of the spectrum of viewpoints. And I kind of thought that was a beneficial experience. I mean, we didn't change each other's minds or anything like that, but we were able to communicate, and he heard arguments that he had never really heard before. And same thing for me. And I think it's just because we weren't screaming at each other. And I'm not saying like this is like let everybody off the hook for everything that they believe. I'm definitely not saying that. But when it comes to in a more general sense, like
general.
Talking could be
general
something we get better at.
Let's talk more and get better at it. Thank you, Jesus. Thank you, Jesus, for your holy cum in my mouth. Thank you, Jesus. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Sometimes my tics are hilarious, by the way. Feel free to laugh. Yeah, it doesn't bother me at all when people laugh at my tics. I mean, I'm not saying all Touretters feel that way, but me personally, I find them pretty hilarious. So, feel free.
Was there ever a time where you were, well, there's always a time where we struggle with it, but was there a time where you were really kind of concerned about how that conveyed to the outside world and maybe you weren't so comfortable sharing it?
Yeah. So some people grow out of Tourette's. Mm-hmm. I grew into Tourette's. So I had some simple tics when I was, pretty young, probably, 8 or something is when I think I first got diagnosed. I can't say for sure. But, I remember just kind of explaining my eye blinks and such, and my twitches, but it didn't really concern me that much as a kid. As I got older, I thought a little bit more about suppressing and, revealing. But I think it came to a head when my tics started to become very noisy and very noticeable. And that was probably in my very early 20s, like when I was 20 years old, 21. And around that time is when the complexity of my tics just exploded. Both motor tics, vocal tics, started swearing, repeating, saying random things, throwing things, shaking, just all sorts of very noticeable actions. And at that point, at first it was pretty difficult because I wasn't used to that attention. But honestly, I guess one thing I decided was that to the best of my ability, I would not avoid situations because of my Tourette's. Now I'm a little bit more loosey-goosey about that, but at the time that was very important to me.
Yeah.
So that I could become more comfortable in public and not shy away from that. And so now I'm extremely open about my Tourette syndrome, and I'm very used to being a public spectacle. And it doesn't bother me as much. In fact, it's good anecdotes for my students. I teach public speaking, so
really,
ironic. Choose your words wisely, motherfucker.
Is this why you got into public speaking, to maybe even kind of fill a void for this perspective on communication and how we convey ourselves?
I think it's definitely not unrelated. So I teach public speaking because that is the gen ed course in the Communication Arts and Sciences department.
Okay.
So most graduate students in my department teach public speaking. But as far as my journey to become interested in communication arts and sciences, yeah, I think Tourette syndrome has a lot to do with it.
What are there any things that I've heard from people who, like, once they finally got to the level of self-acceptance with their situation, they went at it wholesale. They're just like, this is just going to help me be me. And other people, I think, kind of piecemeal it, maybe kind of ease into it, maybe drop masking here and there if possible, and maybe tell one person, and, instead of just floodgates. Was there a transition like that? Or is this the kind of thing where it just, I could just resist my own nature all the way, and who knows what problems that could cause, or bad habits that could cause within my life, or I could just kind of open myself up and see what happens.
Yeah, I think that in my case, that was definitely an option when my tics were subtler, but once my tics became more public, I think my big fear was being misunderstood. So I think that, I was going to be noticed either way. There was just no hiding it. So I'd rather people understand why I'm doing what I'm doing. So I tell everyone now. I tell like servers, ahead of time. I said, hey, just letting you know I have Tourette syndrome. I might make certain sounds or noises or even particular insults. I want you to know I don't mean them, unless I do. Who knows? I'm very open about it with everyone, and I don't remember making a conscious choice about it. I think it's just the situation I found myself in. I think what takes courage right now for me is not telling someone I have Tourette syndrome. I think that's honestly more difficult for me, and it's something I'm learning to get used to.
Teaching public speaking. So I'm thinking of it kind of like an audience member. There have been times, and I am open about my TS at my office place, and like the people on my team, they know it, and they're educated, they're cool, and
they're cool. No, they're not. They talk about you behind your back. Ben, you need to stop being so goddamn naive, motherfucker.
It could be true, but teaching public speaking and me thinking of it like an audience member. I can mask my tics sometimes when I feel it's appropriate to do so. And this is the kind of thing where it's like, if it's an involuntary thing, and, people should be patient with me. But then there's also the kind of pressure I feel from the audience I feel this tic coming on, or I know I'm going to be ticky. I'm just going to stand out in the hallway, so I'm not like a quote unquote disruption the whole time. Do you have any thoughts maybe for people who, in sort of public situations, or maybe like they're at a different kind of conference, like a trade show or something like that, or they're listening to someone give a presentation? What are the new rules maybe of what's appropriate and what isn't when it comes to something like Tourette syndrome versus the let's be quiet situation, or being in the library or whatever? But I'm kind of thinking of it like in this public speaking context where there's a speaker, there's an audience, and there's decorum, and there's politeness and all that. Where does Tourette syndrome fit in for you when it comes to withholding your tics and trying to maintain that sacred, kind of respect?
Sure. That's so hard. I think that's such a complicated question. I don't think I have a perfect answer, but I can talk about some of the factors that weigh in on my particular decisions.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So when I'm teaching, I really can't step out when I'm ticking. I kind of have to be there. So it's not much of a choice there. But I do let people know ahead of time, and I don't really suppress, because suppressing is hard after a while. I'm sure you know.
Yeah.
But there's other times like what comes to mind right now is I was in a small conference room seeing my hero Angela Davis speak. So Angela Davis being an academic, prison abolitionist, for a while the head of the U.S. Communist Party. a big important role in the Black Power movement. And I was really worried that I was going to disrupt her speech by saying something awful. And so I suppressed really hardcore that entire 2 hours because it was important to me that I show her the respect that she deserved. But sometimes I wonder about that decision. I wonder if, well, I guess here's another thing I think about is it worth educating people?
Right. Yeah.
Or is that just going to be a distraction?
Exactly.
It's not about you.
That's how I think of it. Is this something I can get out of the way kind of quickly, or is this just going to derail everything if I have to take the time to, here's what was going on, and
right.
it almost creates more questions, and maybe is just the maybe kind of a counterintuitive way of educating somebody.
Absolutely.
And what's their starting point going to be if I'm going to, maybe this isn't the right time, and there's so many things that can just tie up your brain.
And then equally important, if not more important, is where you are. Do you have the energy to endure that public spectacle and go through all that education, or would you rather just kind of avoid that?
Right.
That's something to think about for sure. So I remember at conferences is when I tic, I think, the most. And for the most part, I think, hey, you know what? This is educational opportunity for everyone. I'm just totally going to let myself tic. And if anyone has any questions, I'll answer them. But, it's a conference where we should be learning stuff. But at the same time, the keynote speaker had some important things to say. And I remember stepping out very consciously because I didn't want, because that wasn't my space. I didn't want to interrupt that. I didn't think it was worth it. Another time, I might step out at movie theaters when I'm really ticking because I don't want to disturb other people. But when I saw Motherless Brooklyn in theaters, I was just like, you know what? This is part of the educational opportunity for everyone. I'm going to improve their experience by ticking loudly the entire movie. And I
in
did
the theater.
Hilarious, and I loved it.
Yeah. It's when I saw Motherless Brooklyn, it was in LA, and this is the one where like Ed Norton came out and like introduced it, and the whole audience was people with Tourette or people who live with people with Tourette. It was great, and it included that there was a young woman. This is maybe a couple of years ago or 3 years ago, where she got kicked out of a movie theater for ticking, and you're being disruptive, you have to leave, and so she was there, and so she was able to be there in a setting like in a theater, in a commercial theater, with a whole audience of people ticking like crazy. I use the word crazy in quotes, and watching Motherless Brooklyn, where the central character has Tourette. And it was just such a different experience to, like, okay, you're in a theater right now. None of these worries matter at this moment. And I guess maybe to kind of clean up how I set this up a little bit for anybody listening, this is with what we've been talking about. This is not us saying, like it's the right decision to stay quiet during a presentation or hide your tics or whatever.
Sure.
These are just the questions, that come up in your mind that, it's like, gosh, are there like ethics to this that are going to be unfair to me, or, what is this? And these are questions I still like. I love probing them because I don't have any sort of clean, perfect answer, and maybe there isn't one, but just, again, talking about this makes me better at talking about it and thinking about it better. We've had so many good things. And while I think kind of staying on a pretty consistent topic, and I think that's awesome that we were able to do this much with it. And I know there's a whole lot more too. I mean, this is like a focus for you, the rhetoric and the language we use and the power we give it, or the power it might have. And I mean, is there anything that I didn't ask about that you think is important, or anything that you would like to say? Or it's possible that we started on something and then I just got us on a completely different track without finishing the thought. But is there anything left hanging out there for you?
I think you did a fantastic job. I think, I've learned a lot from this conversation, and, I really appreciate it. Something I didn't emphasize as much and I don't want to get too far into the details of this, but, there are interesting ways in which having Tourette syndrome and being a trans woman, are interconnected.
Yeah.
Particularly in the way that my body tends to be constructed as a threat. And that's been something that has had a major impact on my life.
Can you describe what you mean when you say threat?
Yeah. So, I think that, being a trans woman in general can make people feel uncomfortable. And I have to think very strategically and carefully about the ways that I present myself in public and in private, and the ways I comport myself to minimize the appearance that I'm a threatening figure.
Yeah.
So, for example, trans exclusionary radical feminists, or TERFs, they call themselves gender critical sometimes, will say that I am a man in a dress who is trying to invade women's safe spaces in order to sexually abuse them.
Right.
Now that's false. That's
right.
Just patently false.
Of course.
But variations of these assumptions live in public culture. Yeah. And I have to be very careful not to about how I engage in public and private, so as not to feed into those stereotypes. Now, having Tourette syndrome, as well as CPTSD and various other things, it just adds to that difficulty exponentially, because not only am I already perceived as a threatening creep to both men and women. Men because I'm threatening their masculinity, and women because I'm appropriating their womanhood, but also because I have Tourette syndrome and I say and do violent things, or things that seem violent, words that are not nice, sudden actions and movements, and like touching and all those things. It makes it seem like I'm a very dangerous, threatening person to be around, and I feel like that's just the opposite of who I try to be.
What a pressure too, because maybe that's something I haven't thought about so directly, is the perception that someone might have of let's just say Tourette or the trans community. The pressure that someone who's a member of that community might feel in public to not do things that support or give the other, the people who have the false narrative, giving them any material to say, see, I told you so. It's just people, perceive things the way they do. But yeah, there is also that, I'm not saying that I'm giving this value, but there is that's another brain game you can play with yourself of, am I just supporting a stereotype by doing this, by being completely myself? And should I hide this from them so they don't have this artillery against me in my community?
That's right. Right.
And I'm not saying like that's the right thing to do, or that justifies it, or that justifies other people, or you have to appease everybody who comes around you, or anything like that. But yeah, this is just another one of these ways that you can just kind of incidentally police yourself, because dynamics are so complicated when you have a bunch of different people together.
Sure. Absolutely. In terms of policing myself, but I'm going to say, you ask questions about like self-love, self-acceptance, and self-policing, and all that's a reality. I do police myself often, and it is a struggle to accept myself. But I got to be honest, a huge part of it is, other people policing me, other people not accepting me, other people telling me that I'm not welcome, other people discriminating against me, other people saying terrible, terrible, nasty, nasty things to me.
Yeah.
And it's just, it's just part of it.
I mean, I'm so glad we've talked about this way because, I've said it on past episodes that Tourette syndrome can be a really relatable thing, even if you don't have it, because the involuntary factor, the fact that you have an insecurity that maybe you want to hide. And I've noticed that, when people open up and they do talk about their vulnerabilities as such, other people feel comfortable doing it as well and may come to you for advice when they wouldn't have before because they don't feel like they had that sense of accessibility with you. And like these vulnerabilities help. But the way we've kind of gone about this and thinking about this from a few different dynamics within the same person or within the same body, I'll say, is really important. And I think sometimes easy to forget because we talk about, the comorbids and OCD and sleep issues and things like that. But, still being a human being and subject to all the dynamics and far reaches and differences that humans can be subject to from birth or from conditioning or from whatever it is. It's just, it just reinforces more power of just listening to other people's stories so you don't fill in their narrative erroneousally. And this is an important episode. I'm just going to say, I mean, this is a really great episode. Talking because I mean it's a theme and language matters and we that's a refrain and we talk about it, but really kind of digging in to how it affects a human and how it can affect a community and how it doesn't have to be that way is just so massive. And this has definitely benefited me to talk to you about this.
I'm so glad. And thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Yeah. And for anybody who wants to connect with you or see any of your work or anything like that, are you accessible on social media or?
Yeah, I'm Sophia Maier on Facebook. That's my usual one. My Twitter is at Aunt Sophia A. Maier. Oh, and Maier is Maier.
And you're Sophia with a PH.
Yes, Sophia with a PH. Hopefully, sometime soon, I will have another article coming out that's going to be a version of my master's thesis. And my master's thesis I called Tourretorics. Tourette's and Rhetoric. Yeah.
May I appropriate that as the title of the episode?
Absolutely.
Thanks for listening. Thanks so much to Sophia Maier. I'll have her info with this episode at tourettespodcast.com. I have a feeling we could do multiple future episodes with her because I don't think we even scratched the surface in terms of the stories and perspectives that she could share with us. This was great. If you have any feedback, anything to add or flip sides or anything like that with regard to what we were talking about on this one, please use the contact form at tourettespodcast.com or email tourettespodcast@gmail.com with a voice recording. Something you can do, you can just speak your mind into your voice memo app on your phone and you can email it to me at tourettespodcast@gmail.com. You can also go to the Tourette's Podcast discussion group on Facebook. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of members. A perfectly civil and accepting place. Thanks to the management of Sophia, a different Sophia the admin, and I always encourage everybody in the group to tell Sophia thank you. These conversations, again, not censored, and the point is to throw out the turnstiles and get to a flowing conversation that bears the honesty we need to make informed judgments. We learn new things from it. It's good for the people doing the talking, certainly is for me, and it's always good to hear from you. Shout out to a listener named Maria who wrote in, appreciate your feedback. Maria had really valid criticism, and I'm going to work her perspective into the show. That'll be coming up. If you have any thoughts for the show, for improvement, things I'm getting wrong, anything like that, again, contact me, tourettespodcast.com. We'll be back next week. Thanks, everybody. This is Ben.